What's up, y'all? Welcome to Conversation Piece with Patrick Armstrong. I am the titular Patrick, and this is a show where we talk about the missing pieces of the conversations we're already having. Shout out to all our returning listeners, and a high five and hello to everybody joining us for the very first time. I appreciate you being here with us in 2024. My guest today is a comic artist, writer, and colorist who has been attending anime and comic conventions since 1999 and loves to cosplay, lift weights, and cook. They are best known for their work as an artist on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Saturday Morning Adventures comic series, as well as their debut graphic novel, Monstrous, a Transracial Adoption Story. It is my honor and privilege to welcome Sarah Myer to the show. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to meet you face to face because I've been following your account on Instagram for a while, and I appreciate all that you do. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for those kind words. I really appreciate it. We have been connected for some time, and I said this before we hopped on air, but I'm going to say it again. I feel like this is a long time coming. You have been not only, like you said, supporting me online, but we have been, I feel like, trying to have a conversation about Monstrous for a little bit, and I have just recently finished, and it is absolutely incredible and one of the best depictions of an adoptee's experience that I have ever laid eyes upon, especially over the last 3 years as I've been on this journey. So thank you for this work, and thank you for being patient with me as we get this conversation set up.
No worries. I hope Don Rosa isn't tuning in, but I actually still have 2 volumes of The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck that I got for Christmas in 2022 that I haven't finished reading yet. So yeah, I completely understand. I think everybody has a lot of like reading lists and to-do lists with that. So
yeah, the TBR list, which I did not know what that, I'd never heard of that term until like 2 years ago. And I all of a sudden completely understand it because I've got books on the bookshelf that I am still working through that I've pulled out. And my wife is furious every time I come home with more books because she's like, we don't have any space for this. And I'm like, but I got to read them and I'm going to read them. They're just over here. It's totally fine. So
right.
I gave you a little bit of an introduction here, but for folks who are listening who may not know who you are, do you mind sharing just a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I was born in 1986 in Seoul, South Korea. Allegedly, I guess, at least due to according to the paperwork. And I was adopted, and I grew up on a 10-acre farm in rural northern Baltimore County, Maryland, and in a really big sort of, it was not a big town. It was a small town that was big into football and the like. So. And there was not a lot of diversity, and you'll hear probably a little bit more about that later. But ever since I was a little kid, like for as long as I can remember, my earliest memories are going to see The Little Mermaid in the theater in 1989 with my mom, and then I cannot really remember a time when, as a young, very small child, I was not watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on TV and other cartoons that many people of a similar age will probably, also recall watching incessantly. And ever since I can remember, I've wanted to be an artist of some sort. I wanted to be an animator for some years, but once I sort of realized that, it was like as I got older, when it was going into more CGI and which is amazing, I realized though I'm more all about just the pen and paper and the line art drawing. So I kind of switched slightly and went off into a little bit of a trajectory into comics. And so basically telling stories through art has always been my dream. And after quite some time, I've been able to realize that. And I'm very thankful for the opportunities I've had recently.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I definitely watched Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles growing up. I remember very much being into Yu-Gi-Oh! And Dragon Ball Z because they were on back to back on Saturday mornings before I would have to go do whatever activity that I was in. So those were 2 of the ones that I really liked. I also liked like Digimon
Yeah.
and the Pokemon cartoon was on that time. Like there were a whole plethora of things, and those are the ones that really stuck out because literally Saturday mornings were when for whatever reason, we had like a small TV in the dining room, and I was
Mhm.
able to just sit and watch. And my mom would be like, "All right, turn that off. We have to leave." What other cartoons and stuff stuck out to you, like you were really watching at that time?
Your experience watching cartoons up until the moment that you have to leave, or in the morning maybe, was my experience with Sailor Moon.
Mm,
The original Deke dub that aired in the early '90s, and I watched that on syndicated television. The funny thing was, I remember that half the episodes that I watched when I first stumbled upon it was like UPN channel 20 in Baltimore,
mm.
before, and we didn't have cable growing up, so that was just like a syndicated, channel, and I could not see the picture clearly because we had an antenna. Like, I feel like I might be dating myself to some of your listeners, and I might be a hair older than you, I think,
I was born
maybe?
in '90, so just a
Okay,
few
just
years,
yeah,
not
just
too
a little
much.
bit. So we're still from that same sort of late '80s, early '90s generation, and yeah, I Sailor Moon was really formative, and then before that, I think even was or about the same time maybe was Mighty Max, which needs more love. That it starred Rob Paulson, the famous
Oh yes,
yeah,
okay.
as Max, and it was basically Polly Pocket for boys was the toys that had come out. They were like clamshell cases, and they would open up and it was a play set, and there was one where it was like Max in the magma lair of Skullmaster or something, and it would be little tiny toys. And they made a cartoon that was based on that in the early '90s, and it starred Richard Mull, I believe, as Norman, the Guardian, and Tony J as Virgil, the guiding chicken, and then Max was this like blonde-haired kid who looks sort of like the Burger King Kids Club leader from that time. Like, he had the sideways, baseball hat,
Yep.
but they visited new settings every day. My dad and I actually used to watch Mighty Max on syndicated television like at 6:30 in the morning or something before I had to leave for elementary school. So,
I
yeah,
love that. I
it was
love
such a
that, and
memory.
I can totally resonate because we also had an antenna, no cable, and
Yeah.
we had the little thing that you could like you had to turn it, the dial to like move the antenna to catch the right signal.
Mhm.
Um, but my first experience, so Sailor Moon is very formative within Monstrous, and my first experience with Sailor Moon was actually on Cartoon Network, and I
Mm.
only could watch that on cable at my grandma's house,
Yeah.
which was also the place that I found myself watching like anime shows that are outside of Dragon Ball Z, like with
Right.
like on Toonami. And cable was like this entryway into a whole new world.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Kinda similar for me in terms of, like, I had friends who had cable, and I'm sure I was a little bit, like, crazed in a way, about it. If my friends had, a PC with a color printer first, and if their internet was faster than ours when we got, like, dial up, I was like,
Yep.
"Can I come to your house and download Sailor Moon GIFs?" Or GIFs, however, but, and yeah, I this is weird, but even like I have a very early memory of so my grandfather on my mom's side lived briefly with our family in what then became later my sister's bedroom, and
Mm,
weirdly, like, he had his own phone line and his own sort of TV setup there. It was like a separate kind of thing. And I remember as a really, really young toddler, like before he moved out, I have a vague memory of going up there and watching cable on his television. It was only on his. And watching
interesting.
The real Ghostbusters.
Oh, sure.
It was an episode where, like, I have this vivid memory of getting scared and deciding I didn't wanna watch it because they were, like, running from a giant pizza that had appeared in the sky and, like, smashed, like, on the road, and I don't know why that terrified me as a kid. I think it just it I suddenly I think I misinterpreted that scene as a child and thought, "Oh, no, they've been shrunken. What's going on?" Like, and I just ran. I was like, "Never mind," that's, like, the only memory I have of, like, watching TV in his room, and then but yeah, when I was older, I definitely, like, I was so jealous of my friends who had, cable and watched Toonami.
Yeah.
I watched, like, I got Outlaw Star, though, and some of the other anime that was on it on
Okay.
VHS. I collected the videotapes from, like, Bandai at the time
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
releasing it. Yeah.
It's so interesting to me how a lot of these cartoons and stuff that were coming out, like you said, Mighty Max was based on a toy.
Yeah.
How they made so many cartoons out of these toy figures and stuff. And then a decade, 2 decades later, we're seeing all of these live action versions, and now you have like Barbie even has this live action
Yeah.
movie that are like these huge blockbuster things. I'm waiting for a Sailor Moon live action adaptation, and I'm
Oh
trying
man.
to think that there was at one time.
There was a rumor. There was a
Okay,
lot of
that's what I thought.
yes. And I remember being very excited about it because somebody had done like a at the time, I guess it was sort of an early CG kind of rendering where they were
Mm.
like it was like they had photoshopped, I guess. I maybe not like 3D CG modeling, but like photoshopped a photo of a real woman, some just random woman, and had like they had it as like the repeating background on their, Alta Vista website, their AOL homepage or something. And there was a rumor that Gina Davis wanted to play Queen Beryl. And I remember going to the local library, getting on the computers there for the
Yep.
World Wide Web, and
Yep.
like reading about it and going, this is going to be amazing. And everybody at my school's going to see this movie when it stars Alicia Silverstone as Sailor Moon, as Serena. And I thought everybody's going to think it's so cool and they'll realize,
Speaking of like all of these different cartoons that not only were formative in our childhood but inspirations to
Mhm.
particularly the work that you do. I said at the top I recently finished Monstrous, and again, in my opinion, one of the best depictions of an adoptee's experience that I've ever taken in. And throughout there are just so many references and even just really great depictions of some of these different things like Sailor Moon, like the turtles. um I think that it's what's really interesting to me about it as a graphic novel. I feel like it blurs the line of fiction and nonfiction in a way that you don't see very often, but it's very much your story. For
Mhm.
people who haven't read it, can you give us like a high level overview?
Sure. I will describe it like it's just a third person summary. So there's this kid named Sarah who is a South Korean adoptee, who grows up in a rural, town, and who one of the earliest experiences that Sarah has is seeing The Little Mermaid, becomes obsessed with cartoons and animation, always kind of seems to delve into their imagination, when Sarah's thinking about situations that happen in preschool through all the way up through the end of high school. And it gets more and more, I think, emotionally caustic, the things that Sarah imagines, but it starts out as things as simple as I'm a little bit too rowdy at preschool, and the kids don't want to play with me. So I'm kind of envisioning myself like I'm this giant monster, like the kind of thing I might see in a cartoon. And then as Sarah sort of experiences racism from a variety of sources and bullying at school, Sarah starts to internalize that racism, and that monster figure develops into an embodiment of just internalized racism. We see the toll that it takes on Sarah's mental well being and emotional well being. But through it all, you keep seeing these depictions of Sarah's way of kind of coping a little bit, or reframing some of these real life situations through the lens of, say, Pokemon.
Mm,
Dealing with a falling out with a friend that really felt like a huge emotional betrayal, and Sarah's like, maybe it's like Ash and Gary, who knows? That kinda is helping Sarah a little bit.
sure.
Sarah also explores, their gender really, in their teenage years, because they start to realize they relate to, and maybe always kind of have related to, male characters just as much, if not more, than the female characters. But Sarah desperately wants this vivid, colorful inner imagination world to be, uh, their reality. And towards the end of the book, no spoilers, I guess, I don't know. Sarah comes to a internal kind of conclusion and realizes that that can happen just through Sarah's own, I guess, esteem. Coming to
Sure.
terms with who Sarah really wants to be.
I love it. When did you first realize you wanted to tell your story in this way?
Honestly, that came maybe later than you might expect. I would say about in 2016, maybe a bit earlier. But uh, so I going back to grad school, and for my MFA thesis. I actually, for my degree, my master's degree in comics, basically, the requirements were we had to write an academic thesis and we had to have a 20-page visual component.
Mm,
And I had been at the time experimenting with kind of journal comics, where I sort of say like, I draw a comic and it's kind of quick and it's like, oh, the other day I was at the mall and this kid was staring at me and asked, said this, and here's how it made me feel, and I depicted that, and I had kind of been dabbling with using comics to express things that are very difficult to put into words sometimes. Things like, internalized racism that I've been really struggling with my whole life. Um, but that I was old enough at that point, in 2016 to really understand what I was experiencing with that,
sure.
and as well as phobias, and just trying to find a way to like bridge that gap between how you see the world and what you're thinking, and just really wanting to like show people what you're seeing in your mind's eye, and
Yeah.
hopefully expressing the emotion through that. And comics was just such an effective vehicle for that. Jean Luen Yang's American Born Chinese had a huge influence on my thesis. In fact, it's one of the comics cited in the thesis because I decided to write my thesis about how one can depict or draft their own self identity through drawing an autobiographical comic. And that thesis visual component is actually what led to my editor on Monstrous approaching me about the book. So I
Okay.
fell into Monstrous in a way that I wasn't shopping it around to people. I had hoped to one day maybe publish something based on those um, kind of journal comics and that thesis, but you can find a prototype of that of Monstrous effectively on the SCAD website,
Okay.
because my thesis is still there, but as a published paper that they just have in their archives. But and you'll see some similarities, but Monstrous was basically a 270 plus page version of that expanded. And I'm
Sure.
I'm so lucky that my editor approached me, but it was all due to that thesis.
It's so interesting that you weren't like, this was never really your intention. You were just like, I'm trying to graduate. And like, this is a good way for me to do that because I've already been doing it. Like, this is what my thesis is. And I've already been journaling in this way in order to capture that expression of
Mhm.
things that have been hard to articulate. And I think that's the beauty of it. And you said that the thesis is not that, but you can find the bones of what Monstrous would become within that thesis. Were there any things that made it out of there directly into?
Yes, my depiction of Otakon, the first anime convention that I ever attended, there's some scenes directly from it, just
Mm,
redrawn to better match the style. And then, in some ways, the thesis, the final page is like in a nutshell, it shows like me as a teenager taking off a suit and tie like Superman, except
mm.
underneath it's Shinji Ikari from Evangelion's blood suit. And it's like me like flying into this like space. And in a way that very like principle kind of made it into Monstrous.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And yeah, without spoiling, like I feel like I saw myself so much in the pages, especially in your younger years. But really, like I saw myself at the end, and I don't want to spoil exactly like this final confrontation that you have, this final realization, but it very much I felt mirrored my own, only much later in my life because I did this at like 30. Like when I
Mm,
started at 33, even like when I really found that part of myself.
mhm.
And it like honestly, I started to cry when I saw it because it was just so powerful. It's such a powerful depiction of what this journey can look like. Not even just for an adoptee, but for someone just struggling with their identity, struggling to find themselves. I think another thing that really stands out to me about this graphic novel in particular being so autobiographical is that when you think about a memoir,
Mhm.
you think about how emotional that can be when you're in the process of writing it. And those
Yeah.
are just like the words. You have the gift of not just writing the words, but then having these really, really vivid drawings that you are pulling from your own mind to represent and enforce and bolster every written word that you have down there. What was that process like in
Oh
terms
man.
of like managing and navigating the emotional aspect of putting your story into this form?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for those kind words, because that is, I'm going to try not to cry, but like what you said basically is exactly what I hoped would happen when people read the book. And I also appreciate you mentioning that, you think that it can and be applied to anybody who's struggling with aspects of their identity, whether
Yeah,
they're adopted or not, because I really wanted this to have a global appeal to people. So I really thank you. And that means a lot to me.
of course.
Um, so yeah, the hardest scenes to draw were like basically like imagine if you will, sometimes me like throughout the pandemic, I was working on this book. So there were some days when I'd be like, today I have to finish inking 20 pages 28 and 21. Uh and I'm just like going through, and then there were other like pages that were just so I was like crying during sometimes when I didn't expect it. It was almost a weird,
Mm,
like cathartic. It hit me out of nowhere. There were some scenes that I thought I would be really upset while drawing, and I was
sure.
prepared for it. Then there were others that I was just like, why am I crying? This really, I didn't realize that um certain things were still affecting me,
Right.
but then there were other things that felt kind of terrifying, but also really good to get out on the page. Like I felt physically sick when I was drawing some of the internal, like inside the body stuff, because
Oh,
that's
sure.
that's a phobia I still kind of have. Like literally just today while I was working, I put on a YouTube video. First shot was like Mickey Mouse inside a giant's mouth, because I was like, I'll look at this video about Fred Moore the animator, and it came up, and I was like, minimize, oh my god, and I was like, and like I still felt myself like having heart palpitations. I was thinking, man, it's still affecting me, but that it felt good to get those images out on the page though, and I would say that even for the things that were emotionally difficult, because it felt like I was almost getting a poison out of me in a way,
Sure.
but and not necessarily in an I don't think in an unhealthy way too, because I was trying to keep it nuanced. So in many ways, it felt like there's a scene where Sarah in high school even does the thing that Monstrous was aiming not to do, but ran the risk of doing, which is letting all of your internal anger pour out of you in a venting, sort of ranting,
Mm,
toxic spew of like hatred,
yeah.
and sort of thinking everybody's against me. I can't trust anybody, and that might protect you to some degree, but that can poison you really badly. So the book was very cathartic, and I would say the hardest things though to draw were in some ways figuring out how to draw these vague figures that were supposed to depict my mind's eye depiction, or image of my biological parents, because I have
Mm,
nothing to go on. I felt there were times when I would think it's almost like I would snap back and forth between two different brains inside my head, where one of them was like, um, yeah, I hope that I get across that this figure is smirking,
sure.
um, and then there were other times when I'd be like, "Is this too much? Oh, I don't know if this is me. Like, oh, is that like mean?" And all kinds of things.
Yeah.
So it was very emotionally volatile. Being isolated from pandemic, and like just huddled over the Cintiq, like doing it for like about 2 years, and but I I would not trade that for the world though. I think that was and I really appreciated the opportunity to tell the story the way my editors let me do so much with it, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And on the note of the biological parents, I love the depiction because I've recently been grappling with thoughts of my first family. And
Mhm.
one of my big realizations is that I literally cannot imagine what they look like,
Right.
sound like, smell like, that aura. Like
Mhm.
it's impossible for me. Like because I
Mhm.
did so much of just not thinking about it or suppressing, like consciously suppressing the idea of who they might be. Like
Right.
I can't it now in this moment at 33, I cannot even come up with a visual idea. When I watch movies or anything that has like a birth parent style storyline where they come up, I'm like, that is not who I imagine when I
Mm,
imagine my family. But in your story here, I can imagine the shadow and the
mhm.
smirk and the just the subtle hints of what a personality could be. And I
Right.
feel like that is a kind of depiction that we hear articulated some a little bit from
Mhm.
adoptees, but we don't see visually. And this is
Mm.
the first time I feel like I've seen a visual depiction capture what I've felt inside of myself and in my own mind when I try and think about biological family in that way.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, I guess the contrast is those smirking, shadowy figures acting like, you know, now we can move on and like now we're unburdened by this,
Right.
and the contrast, I guess, was like fifth grade Sarah thinking maybe it's like the Moon Princess, like
Right.
with Queen Serenity, and because in a way, I mean, there's cartoon storylines that often kind of touch on things like that I feel are similar and or that I did think were similar as a kid,
Sure.
um, there's even an episode of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the '87 cartoon where it's turtles everywhere, and it's an episode with lots of actual regular turtles that are being captured. And there's a sea turtle that has to lay her eggs, and the turtles have to rescue her. And Michelangelo starts crying when she swims out to sea, and the show plays it kind of for laughs because it's a lighthearted '87 cartoon, but
Right.
like I as an adult, I latched onto that when I rewatched it. I was like, "Wow." And then I remember as a kid, there's a scene in Secret of the Ooze, the live action
Yep.
second movie, where they find out, "Oh, you were created from this ooze." And Donatello, like, the Jim Henson Muppet, like, character costume, it's like getting real emotion from it, And
Yeah.
there's this part where he's so melancholy and he's really sort of depressed, and as a kid, I remember specifically really liking that scene, but I couldn't quite articulate why, and it was because he he says something like, "I don't know, I thought there'd be more to it, and I can't believe that we were just created like an accident." And as a little kid, I just remember thinking, "Oh, I really like this," like, and and I in some ways it's really I think that as a kid I was just recognizing that they were showing a side to a character that you don't often get to see
Yeah.
in a movie like that, but I really as an adult, I've come to really appreciate those little moments because I realize how much, in a way, turtles were always representing some of that for me.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's wild to think about how people even probably unintentionally can capture some of that really layered nuance that is super specific
Mhm.
to what we have as adoptees,
Right.
transracial adoptees specifically, in this unknown of family
Mhm.
that a lot of people never get, and to have it articulated in a way in a heightened fantastical way is wild because it makes it accessible to think about.
Mhm.
And on the flip side of that, at the same time, because we're young and we're children, and because we don't have a language to articulate why that's affecting us in that way,
Right.
it stays buried. And maybe not buried, but at least it's like we almost keep it to ourselves. Is that a conversation you're able to have with anyone? Like when were seeing these depictions specifically from the turtles that you're like, I need to just like share this with somebody and be like, this affected me in a way. I don't know what it is, but I just wanted to tell someone.
Yeah, there were certain things. I mean, there were certain things that would really make me, upset as a kid. Like,
Yeah.
of course, everybody, I think, regardless, Bambi,
Oh,
and
yeah.
but
Yes.
The Land Before Time, I remember I was forced to watch that movie at daycare, and it really
Oof.
upset me.
Yep.
And I mean, because it's just so depressing in general in many ways. But like, I it's weird because like I had separation. I'm sort of armchair diagnosing, but I had separation anxiety really bad from
Sure.
my mom when I was a little kid. And when she
Same.
would leave me at
Same
preschool,
self-diagnosis. Yes.
oh yeah, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And I don't know if our particular brand of separation anxiety has anything to do with, what one could construe as possibly deep seated fear of abandonment, just fear of like seeing somebody walk away.
Sure.
Um and as an adult, I'm kinda editorializing some of the things, but I can't help but wonder if that Land Before Time thing was double or triple or quadruple layered,
Sure.
or if it was just, "Oh, the sad baby dinosaur's sad, so I'm sad," but, I asked a lot of questions of my parents, I think more so than my sister did,
Yeah.
and I probably heard kind of the same things over and over again from my dad, like, in terms of that, from what they saw in the papers, allegedly, my parents were fisher folk, but I'm as I've gotten older, I'm very skeptical of that, not because I don't believe my dad, but, because
Right.
I don't necessarily believe with more research that I've done, on birth reunions and things and birth searches, I don't really know if I can believe that that's true, so I have so many mixed emotions going back and thinking about, like, what things young Sarah thought about and wanted to know versus how I kind of view even those questions that I was asking,
Sure. Well, it's like we don't get an opportunity to think critically about it. And we're never
Mhm.
taught or modeled how to do that in terms of our own stories. Maybe in the stuff you learn in school, maybe in certain other situations outside of that, like an
Mhm.
extracurricular setting. But when it comes to your own individual story, rarely, if ever, I'll say anybody, not even just adoptees, but anybody is taught to think critically about like what you're seeing or experiencing.
Right,
And
yeah.
parents are doing so much work to just try and protect
Yeah.
their child, whether no matter how well intentioned, the impact we just don't know until you're in your teen years or you're young adult 30 well
Yeah.
on. It's
Yeah.
just like hard to even fathom.
Definitely. I think I read on, there's a Facebook adoptee group, Korean American adoptees, and they were talking about somebody said, that whether you realize the issues that you have to unpack, or that are just built up in your brain, like stacks and stacks of things, as an adoptee, a transracial adoptee in particular, those issues with racial identity, and hurt from possibly racism, even sometimes, unfortunately, within adoptive families, um, that's gonna come out whether it's when you're 10, 18, or 60.
Right.
And they were saying it's like a ticking time bomb. You don't know, but at some point, it's like the bill comes due,
Right. 100%.
And yeah, I think my anger is actually what as a kid, I had a lot of anger, and I think my anger is actually what kind of, in a weird way, helped me to come to terms with those things. It was the fact that I would get so enraged over, racism and things that people, even strangers, would do as a young person. And I still grapple with that even after the events of the book. To be honest, I still dealt with a lot of things when I went away to school. But in contrast, I can't really, I don't want to name names, but in contrast, there are people that I've known who are in a similar situation to me in terms of being a Korean adoptee that I know they experience things like that.
Sure.
They experienced in sometimes the same racism, but they would always sort of act like I was the problem for getting so mad about it. And I think that I was sort of a walking just representation for that thing in the back of their brain that they were trying to keep suppressed. So I get why they pushed me away, but and didn't want to talk about it, and in some cases denied that that was even happening. But at the same time, I think I gotta live the way I see fit. So
Yeah.
do you grapple with anything like that in terms of people, either maybe your past self or people around you who sort of uh, suppress it or want you to suppress it?
Oh, 100%. Well, I appreciate you sharing that because it makes me think of this saying, hurt people. Like,
Hmm.
and especially within community, like within this community, I have 100% seen folks because we run just the gamut of different experiences
Hmm.
that we have. And like, a lot of it's either you fall on the hyper abolitionist side or you're like, oh, I really love adoption and I'm so happy that this happened to me.
Hmm.
And we don't make a lot of space for like that in between, that gray area. And I have definitely witnessed, particularly in the Facebook groups, where there's a lot of invalidating that happens
Hmm.
of other adoptees
Mm,
because they don't have the same experience that we have. And because
definitely.
we are, regardless of what the experience is, and not to invalidate those people, like that they have a certain viewpoint of of adoption as a whole in
Mhm.
their own experience because of what happened with them and because of what they grew up with and because of whatever traumas and abuse that they might have faced or whatever it might
Right.
have been. Like they have those things, and that is why they have this particular viewpoint. And yet, those things fuel the work of invalidation that they might do to someone else who has an opposite experience. But just because they have that opposite experience doesn't mean that it's not as valid as
Right.
theirs. And in those moments, I wish that we could find ways to come together and have a good conversation about it because I think we can help each other in a way because we
Mhm.
do share the lived experience of the transracial adoptee identity, even if the actual lived experiences that we have as individuals is far different.
Yeah.
And because we can have some of these common or baselines, we can then step to each other and like really help each other heal and think about things in ways that we just aren't capable of because of said experiences.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things I love about this book. And I keep coming back to it. Is just that you talk about, trying to capture some of this nuance and not, and you talk about how the scene where teen Sarah like almost goes in the opposite direction of feeling and releasing the anger and placing whatever that might be on everything external, which I
Mhm.
think is totally valid, and are able to work back to this point of, oh, there's something inside too of myself that I need to recognize and find,
Mhm.
embrace, not to spoil, but embrace and heal in a way. And I think
Yeah.
that's why it's so powerful to me is because, again, with the visual element accompanying the dialogue that's happening right there, I think it's so, so powerful. And it is that bridge that
Mhm.
that connects the two different sides in a way that we don't see very often. And I think
Well,
that's
thank
such a
you.
yeah, I think it's such a powerful representation of how we can have that conversation, not just with each other, but within ourselves. Because
Mhm.
if we can't have the conversation internally, then it's going to be really difficult for us to get there in terms of a community conversation.
Right.
And so, yeah, I've definitely experienced that within the community, definitely outside of the community. Like,
Mhm.
there's invalidation that happens all over the place, all
Oh,
the
yeah.
time. Like, my favorite one to call out is just the people who go, "Well, I know so and so, they're adopted and they're fine. So like
Uh-huh.
you're off your rocker, like you are an outlier, you don't know what you're talking about."
Oh, God.
And you get
Yeah.
all these labels.
Right.
And it's like, well, at the end of the day, I can boil it down to you don't know that. You're just speaking for this person. And
Yeah.
so you don't know what they're even going through.
Yep,
And,
definitely.
and so it just happens from all sides at all times. And it's hard to navigate. Like, to be honest, without things specifically designed to help us learn about how to navigate it, like this
Mhm.
book, like the scholarship and academia that's out there, like these kinds of conversations that we're having. Without those things, it's hard to know how to combat. How did you learn to like start to navigate those things?
Man, I wanna say it came, like, in a very, you know, kind of I think there's an actual graph term for this, but I don't remember. It's like, like going up and sort of plateaus and then
Yep.
up and maybe slides back a little bit. It was very gradual and there was a lot of ups and downs, because I and I have to credit my best friend of like 20 years this year, who I met in college. I wanted to write an epilogue in the book, showing depicting the moment when I meet this person.
Mm,
Um, but and interestingly, this friend, you would think that they wouldn't maybe understand how
sure.
I feel because they actually come from a pretty I guess you could say well respected Southern family,
Okay.
and they're white but their uncle by marriage was Japanese. So my friend loved anime and we bonded over that first. Then I remember my friend was talking about maybe within the first 3 months of meeting, was saying something like, yeah, just I feel like people don't understand or believe me when I say, "No, I understand. I get Japanese culture. It's a part of something I was raised with, a little bit." Like,
Sure.
um And they kind of would tell me about how some people don't really believe them when they say, "Oh yeah, well I know this because my uncle's Japanese," and they'd be like, "Really?" Like they obviously it's like they think that everybody's always in a family unit, that everybody's identical to each other, you know.
Right.
um, and I remember that this friend also just got it. I could just tell when I would tell them about things that I experienced as a kid and how I feel about stuff. Like I would say, man, I hate it when people assume I'm not American. You
Mm,
know, I hate it when people assume that I'm Chinese or Japanese, which is not the case. You
right.
know, and or if they find out that I'm Korean, then immediately they want to know why I'm not Korean enough, or they
Mm,
assume I'm very culturally Korean,
right.
and
Tell me
it
about
just
this. Can
yeah.
you say this? Like all of these
Oh,
different things. They want you to
absolutely.
be the teacher now of
Oh
all
yeah,
of this culture.
for sure. And my friend got that immediately, and I think there was this. I mean, we talk a lot about these things, but spoken and unspoken really uh, bond over just understanding that that people make judgments. I mean, boiled down to its barest essence, it's man, I'm tired of people thinking I'm one way just because of certain external factors. How about you? Like so they got it and they understood. So that was a big part of my I think healing, and I'm still really kind of trying to I think heal because I have good and bad days sometimes. Sometimes I can ignore racism if I experience it
Sure.
nowadays, you know? Just the other day, I had some guy on the street because I cleared my throat say something racist, which really
Jeez.
pissed me off. And I was thinking, man, I'm 37, and I'm like, I got mad at him and I yelled at him and I said some things probably I can't repeat here.
I
You
mean, you
know,
can.
I made some gestures, you know, and I was pissed, and he just laughed in my face. I was just so mad, and I thought, and this was like literally a few days ago, and but then there's other times when I'm like, that doesn't bother me, you know, and
Sure.
I might just ignore it, and I feel good for ignoring it. But other times, you know, that waking up in the middle of the night, like, man, here's what I should have said to that guy.
100%.
So it's still ebbs and flows, you know, but I think um I hope that people maybe who don't like to talk about those sorts of things, if they're curious and they read Monstrous, you know, I hope maybe there will be something that they realize that's kind of like something I've thought about, but
Sure.
I'll come back to that, and maybe it'll show them that it's okay to explore those things.
Sure. Well, I like what you talk about, that anger that you used to have. I resonated with that a lot in the book too, because I felt like I was angry for a long time, didn't know what it was, why it
Mhm.
was, how to articulate it. And I just did. And I felt like I was very overly emotional about everything. And like
Mhm.
things would set me off very quickly. And I feel like you show the journey of that anger. And like, even though we get to a certain point that's like, it's not where you are now, it's like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm going off to college, going off to do these things. And like, there's obviously more story to tell. Like you said, there was an epilogue, and I'm assuming that would have been a good precursor for to be continued to have a follow up to Monstrous.
Fingers
Um,
crossed.
but I think it like shows how you can, like you said, how people can think about these things a little bit differently and recognize, oh, that is something that I have experienced a little bit
Mhm.
and kept to myself. And
Right.
so, like you said, you just had this experience where, some of that anger bubbled back up. And I think one of the things the book does is validate the fact that you should be able to feel those things. And
Mhm.
it's not a bad thing that you feel them. And we have to kind of feel those things too, even if sometimes they manifest in destructive ways and even sometimes harmful ways. We don't want that to happen. But
Right.
especially when we're children or when we're even adolescents, teens,
Mhm.
young adults, like it's going to happen if we've never had the opportunity to unpack it, understand it, and work
Oh,
on it.
yeah.
I think one of the most striking things is your ability to capture the internal monster and give these feelings a visual of like what it is and create a personification of it. Can you talk about the process of how you created this vision? Was that always, even when you were growing up, how you envisioned this growing source of discomfort and anger and all of this emotional things that you were experiencing? Or is that something that came up, a depiction that formed as you were writing the story?
Definitely it was something that, uh I created as an adult.
Okay.
Looking back and editorializing what I was feeling, it's definitely an adult creation. Thankfully, I think I would have been. I mean, things would have been a lot harder if I saw that in my mind's eye as a kid.
Sure.
But I did try to incorporate aspects of things that I found terrifying as a kid. Just
Okay.
uh, certain. It's probably some weird amalgamation too of like any like startlingly frightening character from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark with the teeth. I have a
Right.
thing for teeth with fearful images. And then the inky black tears that it cries is more adult editorializing symbolism, but um it's the idea that it's forged from ink. It's forged from a drawing and a drawing inside my imagination.
Sure.
But I have to give like ultimate credit. I think would go to Jean Luen Yang for American Born Chinese. The thing that probably I don't think without this character from American Born Chinese, I don't think that monster depicting internalized racism would exist in Monstrous.
Okay.
And that is the character. God, it hurts to even say it, but the character's name is Ching Ki,
Mm.
from American Born Chinese, and that character was portrayed in a very sitcom, very tongue in cheek, satirical way. And when I read that book, that graphic novel as an adult, that really had an impact on me because I before then I probably hadn't even thought about how to, portray and depict internalized racism, and that's what that character symbolizes.
Okay. All right. Well, I think it's amazing because, and the reason I feel like it's such a good depiction of like what's growing inside of you, because I feel like the monster is literally part of you. And you can see how it like pulls out of you and becomes this heightened thing. And I feel like it it feels like it's not a separate entity.
Mhm.
It does feel like, again, this is part of me that's grown because of these experiences.
Right. Yeah, and I did try to keep some of the shape language implying young Sarah's
Sure.
character design with the pigtails with like the hair that's like sticking up
Yep.
out of it. It's like that becomes kind of the monster's profile in terms of the sharp, spiky like fur that's sticking out.
Yeah.
In a way, it's kind of weirdly cute. I think in some scenes, I'm like,
Sure.
it's not
Hey.
merchandisable for sure, but like, and it's certainly not something. If I have been signing any books, like I don't draw that. Like I'll draw
Sure.
like the little hamster creature from Maker Comics instead that I did. But it's not like hey, thanks so much. Like here's the creepy like internalized racism monster. But
Right. Yeah.
I wanted it to still somewhat be able to convey some like elicit some sympathy during that final sequence we've sort of been talking about.
Sure. I don't want to spoil it. It's so so good, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. But it is. I mean, that makes so much sense that you kept some of that visual language and to lead into that final scene. One of the things that it made me think of is this character from New Mutants, the comics No Girl.
Oh.
So when her mutation develops, she like her physical form changes, and
Mhm.
her mutant ability is to like go into your dreams and make your dreams real, and like it's really like visceral and surreal in a lot of different ways. And just like again like the way that the internalized racism monster grew, it just like I don't know, it felt very reminiscent of that. And because it came out of imagination too, it
Mhm.
was like growing out of your own brain a little bit. Like it just made me think about that. And I didn't assume that there was an inspiration there, but that was just one of the things that I kept thinking about. Maybe because I've been rereading some of these new Jonathan Hickman X-Men comics,
Mhm.
and she's pretty prominently featured in one of those. But yeah, I just thought there was similarity there, like crossover with that character. So yeah, just something
I
that I was
am
thinking
super
about.
flattered by that, thank you.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
honestly, like, and I guess another inspiration would be Evangelion.
Yeah.
A lot of the kinda, imagery from the Evas is just so very the Evas without their armor on,
Mm,
things like that, the big leering, mouth and the big eyes that are just staring at you.
yeah.
Yeah, but I appreciate that. I'm like that would be a dream, is to like even work for Marvel someday. But yeah,
We're gonna make
I'm
it
excited.
happen. We're gonna manifest for sure. How do you feel like your relationship is with that emotional part of it now, especially having gotten a lot of that emotion into this story that is now out in the world for everyone to see, to be shared publicly and widely? How is that relationship with you now from an emotional standpoint in terms of navigating all of those different things you can feel in at a moment's notice?
I would say I think like weightlifting, and I've had like some slide back in my progress because of the past, few months of just always
Sure.
like having to forego the gym routine, but I'm getting back into it. Definitely physically lifting weights and just getting back into that, like that's something that I think has had a massive impact on my mental well-being. And not just because, oh, exercise releases endorphins, I think on that level, yes, but then I think for me personally, a lot of my anger came from feeling like there was this plethora of voices just constantly sort of in a weird way. Like, this sounds so weird, but like it's almost like everything that I experienced until I was, well, even now, like with that guy on the street, it's like there's constantly, you're fighting off these like whispering voices that are saying you're weak, and it's
Mm,
like coming from everywhere. It comes from a look, comes from people snickering, comes from people, maybe you think you heard them say something racist, but you're
right.
like, I can't, like, I'm not sure, if that was what they just said. I hope they didn't say that, but that kind of feeling like there's this constant fight almost against it. It's almost like the stressful video games where it's like sometimes it's like even a bonus game or something where it's like you have to like keep tapping a button at a certain rate,
Right.
or like the light will go out, and like then when you turn the light back on, there's like the enemies are closer.
Yep.
It feels like that, like you're constantly fending it off. And I think that feeling, just physically improving my strength, kind of for just a self-image thing. I definitely,
Sure.
I like sort of having a larger upper body than I did when I was younger,
Yeah.
and so that definitely helps a lot. But um I and I know this sounds quaint, but I go for a lot of walks. I think that moving to the city where I can actually walk around the harbor has helped me a lot.
Sure.
um in Savannah, I would walk, but I would always have to sort of drive my car to, downtown and park somewhere and then walk, But
Sure.
now I feel like I can walk outdoors a lot. So that helps. I think it just helps to have time when you're not letting daily just life and work
Right.
distractions interfere with you. At least letting yourself be and like letting yourself work through it.
Yeah. Well, you get a chance
Um,
to just exist, like
yes,
in the way that even working and like I don't think it may be I could be wrong, but like telling this story is probably a blend of work and just like personal release in a way
yeah,
that a walk can potentially be. But you're also like, there's also the part of you that's like in almost like a business sense, like, okay, this is something that is going to be part of my portfolio, part of the work that I do.
right.
And then like to have something where you can just get away, whether it be weightlifting, whether it be going for a walk, where you can just exist as yourself
Hmm.
without the pressures of producing is
Yeah,
something that I think everybody can benefit from.
definitely. And I have to admit, not that I'm not that I'm a proponent of like embracing too much anger, I guess, but there have been a lot of times when anger actually fuels my drawing,
Mm,
and not necessarily that it comes out in, not like I'm drawing nothing but angry faces or something,
sure.
but like there have been times when I'm like mad about something and I'm like, "Ah, I'm so pissed about this totally unrelated thing. I'm gonna work it now on a turtles page that and just let that kind of heightened energy like drive me through.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like what's that phrase is, the best revenge is a life well lived,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um but also at the same time, you don't want to be thinking too much about those people who made you mad while you're like, getting your revenge by living that life. But
Right.
yeah,
Well,
I think I've always had just like too much energy. I think that's my problem.
sure. Well, and it's just like we can release all of that energy, whether it be anger, whatever it might be, into
Mhm.
one particular thing. But having a multiple different pursuits to be able to release it is good. And also, like you said, you can be angry about as something completely unrelated and then do really great work. And it's like just the emotion that you feel can empower you in a way. Cause it's like, I'm going to take this and use it to do something better, or even like think about something just different in a way.
Mhm.
And like when I experience anger now, I've gotten to, and shout out to therapy, but I've gotten to this point where I can where I don't like that I necessarily feel it, but in whatever the situation might be, but I understand now that I can I feel the anger and then I stop and ask myself why. And like
Right.
where is that coming from? And even if I don't use it to channel into something, maybe I'll go for a walk, maybe it's just it exists for a little bit.
Mhm.
But after feeling the anger, I can start to really unpack and deconstruct it in a way
Yeah.
that I never used to be able to do
Mhm.
pre-therapy. I would just do it and then just be angry and stew and then kind of try to move past it and forget it. And
Right.
now it's like, how does that, what was that doing? Where was that coming from? And then that process allows me to then be inspired to do something, to create, to sit down and just talk into the mic for 20 minutes about whatever
Yeah.
that might be. And it actually, the anger becomes something beautiful in a way.
Right. It creates something
Exactly.
constructive, right? I
Exactly.
mean, in some ways I kind of feel like your your account on Instagram where you talk about these things and you broadcast them out there and you make the posts that have, your thoughts.
Mm,
I really like, in many ways that's angry Patrick, I want to say, maybe fueling a good, you know what I mean? Like you're like, I'm going to take this anger and make it something
sure.
that helps people,
I
and
appreciate
and
that.
articulates it. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a little bit like that. And I'd say that it's and it's especially looking back on my previous on my experience and pulling some of those moments where I did feel a lot of anger
Mhm.
and trying to not turn it into something different, but trying to reframe in a way that serves me, in a
Right.
way that it really detracted and extracted from me in the past.
Right.
Now I'm at a point where I can mold it into something just a little bit different
Yeah,
that not only serves myself, but hopefully can help serve other folks who might feel a similar way or
for
have
sure.
a similar experience.
That was the thing that stood out to me about your account was like, oh my God, when I saw like one of the first things, where you had written it, like your thoughts. And I was like, oh, okay, this person gets it for sure. And I can't remember specifically what it was, but you talk about a lot of intimate things that adoptees face, and I was like, this, I feel seen. But yeah, it's kind of like with the reframing, it's sort of like when two people are talking, are exchanging words, it could be an argument,
Hmm.
but then it could be a discussion.
Yeah.
And kind of like uh rather that if you disagree with somebody, it's almost like you're having this within yourself. If you disagree
Right.
with some portion of yourself, the destructive anger is like arguing back and forth. But then like you might say to asking, why am I angry? Where's this coming from? That's like you've changed it into a discussion.
Right.
And externally people doing that, that's something that I try to do, I guess, or ignore. But if I read a comment that I don't like, I'll try and sort of make it into a discussion if I choose to engage,
Sure.
online. And I've tried to do that in recent years with like, if I feel like it's safe to do so, obviously. But um, with encounters with people who say racist things, now I'm on a good day, I'm probably more likely to say to them, um, that's really racist, and I don't appreciate that. Why do you think that?
Right.
Or even just saying, why do you say that? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or even joke about it. Like if they give you the dreaded uh, fake Chinese
Oh,
speak,
good Lord. Yeah.
and heavy quotations around that. But like, I'll sometimes, if that happens now, it's I've said, I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're saying, kind of, and it's kind of a fun way of like just watching the shock wash over their face when they realize, you just spoke to me in perfect English. I don't what I'm like,
Right.
yeah, you know?
Yeah. When you flip it on to the perpetrator,
Mhm.
it's not only feels empowering for yourself, but it like hopefully pushes them in the direction to have the discussion. And I
Right.
think your graphic novel does that in a way that we just haven't seen yet, and in a way that's going to reach more people who fall outside of that particular spectrum of film and television watcher. And I think it's really, really important for us to have something like this to be able to have a different type of discussion.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I, ironically, I'm afraid to articulate this wish. It's such a big, like, hope, but I wouldn't say no to a film adaptation if that ever happened, you know?
A
But
100%. This
I'm
should be a
hoping
film.
well, I feel like that's very on my part, I feel like I'm being too, like, I don't know, I'm being greedy, but it's, you know, I don't know, I have this dream that, I hope that one day it would, be like half animation for the imagination portions in different styles and like half live action. Just
Yeah.
saying, but I thank you for saying what you said about it reaching people. I really do hope that it'll uh even if somebody's kind of maybe just thinking like I'm tired of my friends sort of stereotyping me because they think I'm the jock. Why can't I study hard? You know what I
Sure.
mean? Even something as simple as that, I feel like everybody comes up against that conflict that is rooted in the story of Monstrous a lot,
Yeah.
throughout their lives in varying degrees, and a lot of people just never think about it and how much it affects them. When
100%.
like what you said with hurt people.
Yeah.
Behind every chauvinistic attitude or every kind of scoffing remark, it's something at some point in that person's life caused them to feel like they have to put up some guard or hurt other people before they they get hurt themselves, and they're often not even aware of it. So and I mean, not to say I still make a lot of like mistakes, I'm sure, but I at least I think being aware of those things that's really hurting you inside is like a big first step. I think
100%.
it's more terrifying when somebody is almost like just totally unaware of it and they just go through life and don't think about it. That's more terrifying to me than somebody who is hurtful with intent.
100% because they're not aware, like you said, they're not aware of the harm that's being caused. I
Right.
literally in my last episode of the show, I talked about three core memories. And I talk about a memory I had in college where I was basically doing that.
Mm,
I had internalized so much, I was such in deep rejection of my identity that I was outwardly harming people and I wasn't even aware
mm,
that that was happening. Like,
I got you.
and
Yeah.
it was just like, and it's just like that is worse in a
Mhm.
way. It's more dangerous because they are not, that person is not going through the process of like addressing where their hurt is coming from and how they're projecting it outwardly,
Right.
like, and it took me then another 10 years to get to the point where I would actually start doing that. And so that
Mhm.
means for another at least a decade I was doing that in ways both subtle and outward that I just didn't know. And so now one of the reasons I do all of this is because in the back of my mind, I'm trying to make up for all of this pain and stuff that I'm have most likely caused over that
Mm,
first 30 years. And while I can give myself grace for that, like not knowing, I
mhm.
also am like, I don't want other people to go through that experience, particularly from the side of the perpetrator. And
Right.
at the end of the day, we can all perpetrate it. The one of the most difficult things, realizations that I've come to in this community is that for some of us, we are so harmed that we then weaponize our personal harm against other people.
Yeah.
And even if we don't realize that we're doing that, it's still happening. And we have
Mhm.
to have a conversation about it because
Definitely.
it's not to invalidate what you're going through, but also like you can't use that to hurt then other people,
Right.
especially within your own community.
For sure. Do you find that you had mentioned earlier at the beginning of the episode that you grew up watching anime and were I guess, can I assume that that means you appreciated Asian aspects of pop culture, or but I guess my question is, having said that about, you having grown up watching anime, when you were going through those times of, like, deep anger, did you ever find yourself, like, almost targeting people, like other Asians, or, making fun of Asian culture, like, in like, a way to kind of push it away? Did you ever find yourself doing that?
Oh, 100%. And the
Mm,
interesting thing is that when I was watching those shows, like like different animes and stuff, like I wasn't watching that from the lens of like, oh, this is cool because it comes from Japan or it
mhm.
comes from Asia or it's Asian centered or anything like that. It
Right.
was like I was viewing it through a white lens,
I
and
gotcha.
like
Yeah.
I didn't see myself when I saw an Asian on the screen. When I saw like Jackie Chan or Jet Li or anything, anybody like that, I didn't view them as like, oh, that's me up there. I
Right.
viewed it as like, oh, there's an Asian person. And then
Mhm,
yes, I would make the jokes. I would do the stereotypical things and was
mhm.
so blind to it all that because I was just trying to push so far away from it,
Mm.
that's where a lot of that harm became internalized. And so
Yeah.
not only was I harming myself, but then again, that self harm would project outwards and
Right.
harm other people.
Right. Yeah. I asked that because I didn't do that necessarily, but I struggled with very uncomfortable feelings whenever I would encounter other
100%.
Asian, especially not so much like my classmates, because there were a few, and I mentioned this um, in the author's note at the end of the book, that there were a few minorities in my environment growing up that I didn't depict because I didn't feel it was my place to tell their stories. And in
Sure.
some cases, one of my friends in high school was also a Korean adoptee and did not, kind of took on a similar attitude to my sister, where it was kind of like
Sure.
that doesn't happen. I don't know. I mean, I'm fine. Like, everything's fine. And was probably thinking, "Why are you so mad, Sarah?" Like, "Why do you
Right.
have to, like, be a pain in the ass?" But, yeah, I my sister used to make fun of me for watching anime in Japanese and would, like, kinda do so. In some ways, I feel like I can kind of connect to my sister a little bit through asking you that, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I feel like I was an amalgam a little bit of both you and your sister, and like the ways that I would be like, "Oh, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong," and
Yeah,
then also be like, but was also very emotional, very angry, but didn't
right.
know why. And then people would ask me why I was so angry, and then
Yeah,
I would just come up with I don't even know what I would say. Well, it's like, oh, I
right.
didn't like that joke for whatever reason, but it wasn't because it was maybe about racial bias because I was making those same jokes myself, but
Right.
it was just like it was just there. And again, I
Mhm.
didn't have the language to articulate what was there. It just was, and I
For
just
sure.
unleashed it.
Yeah.
Um, I really appreciate you coming on here to talk about this. And I'm just looking
Yeah.
up at the clock now, and it's been almost an hour and 10 minutes.
Time has
Um,
flown,
and
honestly.
I told you that it is like 30 to 45,
30,
and we
yeah.
have blown right past that. Um, so we've covered a lot without spoiling too much at the end of the book, too much of the middle and end of the book, which I mean, the whole thing is incredible. The end really, really just like hammers it all home. And I really appreciate everything that you depict there. And again, like I
Thank
think this
you.
will be looked upon as one of the most valuable resources that we have in this community in this moment in time and hopefully for all time. I think it stands that test, and I would be very surprised to not hear it start to be referenced more and more. Not because of this conversation, but just because, like, the longer that it's out, the more opportunities there are for people to come across it, to stumble across it at the bookstore, to pick it up at the library if it's at the library, and again find themselves having this discussion. And I think it's super, super important. And you whether you feel like this or not, you teach so many different lessons to so many people who do end up picking this up. And in this conversation, you've dropped so much knowledge and gems and things that we're going to be walking away with thinking about.
Thank
Who are
you.
you currently learning from? Who is giving you inspiration? Who are people that you're like, this is somebody that I am just constantly going back to, watching their videos or reading their stuff? Who are those people for you at the moment?
Oh man. So I go through obsessive phases, and they still hold on. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yep.
It's just I cycle through, and I am very incredibly hyper. Well, I always have been, really, but I've been realizing my hyperfixation on Walt Disney,
Mm,
and listening to the biography by Neil Gabler
mm.
about Walt Disney. It's called Walt Disney: The Triumph of the American Imagination. And as rah-rah and, like, patriotic as that sounds, it is a very nuanced, depiction of him and his life, and it also discusses a lot of his flaws because he wasn't a perfect
Sure.
person, and I just wanna make that clear for people watching and listening. I don't agree with certain things that he did, but I find that so inspirational, though, like the things that it discusses, like his weaknesses, like his worst moments, the way that he felt anguish when he was a child because he was physically abused by his father. He had his money withheld when he was really young. He came from a life of sort of feeling bereft of certain things.
Mm,
Um, and because of that, it actually, I'm finding in a way that I think of it as more like that is what you were talking about, like, turn that anger into
sure.
something creative and make something. So I think of that book as really inspirational while I'm working. And I've listened to it like 2.5 times now.
Okay.
Because I really, one day I want to make a comic about the life of Walt Disney and kind of utilize a similar thing, that Monstrous did, where it's like
Interesting.
certain things that he experienced and how they impacted his creative works. That'll be I'm going to need a good, like, copyright lawyer behind that book, but like, um, but yeah, that's been really inspiring me, and I try to think about that in terms of, he could have just stayed where he was and put up with it, or but he did really hard things, and he somehow still managed to make something really incredible through just, like, sheer force of will,
Yeah.
and that's really inspirational to me. And just, you know, I can't I guess Dr. Ramani on YouTube is also an inspiration because sometimes if I'm experiencing something where I'm upset about, I'll be ruminating over something maybe that I experienced in a past friendship or something that kind of is coming back and is an issue, like interactions with toxic narcissistic behavior on the part of ex-friends.
Mm,
Um, I will sometimes just find myself binge listening to her YouTube videos because she'll discuss it. And it's that whole, like, name what the problem is, name the fear.
sure.
So learning about NPD and all those things that were at play is, like, such a help to me because I'm like, if I can understand what this thing was that turned my life, upside down for that moment in time, I at least feel some comfort, and I learned so much from listening to her channel. So I guess right now that those are the two I can say. Sorry, that was so long.
No, no problem at all. I am gonna link both of their work in the show notes below. Definitely that book about Walt Disney. That's interesting. I hadn't. I guess I've only come to know the the not so great parts of his life. So, and
Right.
I feel like that's what we talk about a lot. So, I definitely want to check that out.
I was surprised to learn from that book that he actually employed quite a few minorities early in his studio
Interesting.
that people don't realize. There was a Chinese American animator who worked during the era of Bambi, so in, like, the 30s and 40s,
Hmm.
that I thought was pretty cool.
That is cool. That is very interesting. I'll definitely be on the lookout for your adaptation of that book. You can probably get a jump start because Steamboat Willie is now open source, I believe, and
Oh
free for
man.
everyone to now
Yeah,
take.
I can at least write and draw the first 3 chapters of the book without getting sued.
Yeah. Sarah, before you go, I got one more question for you.
Sure.
Thank you so much for sharing everything that you shared. How do we, everybody listening, everybody watching, everybody in this audience, how do we support you going forward? Is there anything that you're working on right now that we can purchase or be on the lookout for? How do we support you as we keep going into 2024?
Uh, I guess the best way to keep up with my work, it would be follow me on Instagram, please. At S Myer, Myer comics. And I post a lot of, work in progress stuff, a lot of like whatever I'm allowed to share of my Turtles work.
Sure.
Um, and I promote my Turtles comics that are coming out from IDW um, on my Instagram account. I also have a web comic that I update from time to time, as well as like any news that I have about convention appearances, etc. I'm going to post that on Instagram. So that's the best place to find me and find the most up to date stuff. I guess in terms of you know um, supporting things that I'm working on. If you like turtles, buying that comic and helping the team, I think,
Sure.
just by, our sales numbers being good, that would be amazing. I would really appreciate that. But yeah, I just appreciate the support that I've gotten for Monstrous. And please, if you liked the book, share it with your circle, because I would love to see more people reading the book.
Absolutely. What's the best way for us to get the book?
Okay, so Amazon has it. Sometimes it's in stock on my shop, which is shop.sarah, Sarah Myer, Myer.net. I have to restock it. And Macmillan's website, official listing for the book, has a lot of different links that you can buy it from officially. But it is also weirdly, it's at Walmart. And it's on Walmart and Target's websites.
Okay.
I'm told from Eric Burnham, the writer of Turtles, he was saying, "Hey, I found your book, Monstrous, in my Walmart," and he lives in Minnesota, so I at least know it's out there.
Nice.
I haven't seen it in any of the Walmarts in Maryland, which has been kind of sad. But so you can, if you just look up Monstrous, a Transracial Adoption Story online, and there will be links to it.
Perfect.
too.
I mean, Minnesota Walmart's is the place to be. There's a lot of Korean adoptees there. So that's a good place to market it and have it in stock. We will link to everything, all of those different places in the show notes as well. Sarah, thank you so much for being here today. We didn't even talk about your current Turtles work. So we're going to have you come back to have that conversation and talk about all the stuff that you've done with those comics, as well as have just more comic talk. Maybe we'll have a side show about just comic books in general, because I just love it.
That would be
but
fun.
Thank you so much for just giving a little bit of your time, giving a little bit of your story, and for making time for us here on the show today. It really means a lot.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Again, everybody, you'll be able to find links to Monstrous, links to all of Sarah's work and her Instagram account in the show notes. And remember, new episodes of this show drop every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. If you want to support our show, please leave us a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts on all of those platforms. Going to go ahead and throw another plug in here for Monstrous. If you've read it, leave a review on any of those review sites. That always helps with those types of things. Those are really great to help support this work. You can also follow us on Instagram at Conversation Podpiece. You can follow me directly at Patrick in the World. And make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, Conversation Piece, the newsletter, out every Monday. Paid subscribers get exclusive access to our companion show, Conversation Notes. That drops every Wednesday. Again, I cannot wait for everything we have coming up in the rest of January as well as February. And we are all very honored and privileged to have been able to hear this conversation with Sarah today. And until all of the rest of the conversations drop, I've been the titular Patrick, and this has been Conversation Piece. See y'all soon.